Did you know that Canada lost a bigger part of its military when fighting in the US-led war in Afghanistan than the United States itself? Fast forward to today, and the American president seems intent on destroying every good relationship America has with its current allies at a rate unprecedented in American history, starting with Canada and Europe. Since Donald Trump took office in January, one proud nation has particularly been on the blunt end of his populist movement's attacks. Canada seems to hold a special place in Donald's heart, one likely fueled by jealousy and a first-grade understanding of international macroeconomics. Many of you have asked us if we can do an episode on Canada's place in the world, including its homegrown military production base and overall situation, now that the US political class seems intent on threatening Canada not just with trade war, but all sorts of blackmail, including military threats. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, and today I'll show you why Canada is more than capable of withstanding Trump's rhetoric, threats, and military blackmail, and how these threats are actually strengthening Canada's resolve, rather than weakening it. First, some history. While the US did not enter World War II until Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and Nazi Germany declared war on the US, Canada had proudly and resolutely defended their European allies since Poland was invaded in 1939. For it, Canada had paid dearly. For a nation which did not get directly invaded, it lost around 50,000 men, while a further 50,000 were wounded. Out of their total mobilized force of 1 million men, that left them with a 10% casualty rate. To put this into perspective, the US lost about 6% of their active duty troops during their entire campaign. The Canadians left their mark on the war and took part in some of the grisliest fighting 3 years before the US even entered it. Canada, together with other Commonwealth nations, sustained heavy casualties in Hong Kong, the raid on Dieppe, and later on famously likely faced one of the best defended beaches during the Normandy landings in 1944 at Juno, together with the Free French, British Commonwealth troops, and Norwegian naval elements. Not only did Canada spill its own blood to oppose fascism from the get-go, it also contributed heavily when it came to training pilots from all around the world to be able to withstand Germany's air war on Britain. Canada trained airmen from nations such as Norway, Finland, Poland, Denmark, France, Greece, the Netherlands, and many other nations. And by the end of the war, Canada's famous pilot schools had trained more than 130,000 airmen for the war effort, making it the single largest contributor to the air war, with American President Franklin Roosevelt later calling Canada the aerodrome of democracy. Coming out of World War II, Canada's defense industry was likely only second to the US in overall production. Going on this high, Canada produced everything from enormous amounts of artillery, aircraft, transport vehicles, tanks, and small arms. And with such a history in aviation, you can probably guess what was on the cards for Canada's aerospace industry. During the Cold War, Canada's aerospace industry thrived, particularly through collaborations with UK companies. This period marked Canada as one of the select global nations capable of developing its own fighter jets. The industry's notable achievements began with the Canuck, the first straight-winged aircraft to achieve controlled supersonic flight. However, this era of innovation came to an abrupt halt with the discontinuation of the Avro Arrow project. While this video won't delve deeply into the reasons behind the collapse of Canada's fighter jet industry, it's important to note that the downturn began with the cancellation of the promising Avro Arrow project. This decline was largely driven by pressure from US companies and the actions of Canadian politicians who signed free trade agreements, which made it hard for homegrown projects to compete. These agreements significantly undermined the Canadian industry by relegating Canadian companies to the role of subcontractors for US defense firms. Historians still debate why Prime Minister John Diefenbaker decided to abruptly cancel Canada's fighter program, but it was likely a mix between cost, pressure from the US, the changeover to the Soviet Union deploying missiles rather than long-range bombers for nuclear weapons, and the Americans wanting to export their fighters and interceptors. What was even more baffling was that Canada then ended up spending similar money on American Voodoo fighter jets instead. A better approach might have been to have taken the Swedish route, while keeping native fighter programs alive cost Sweden a lot, it has later paid massive dividends when it comes to knowledge, military industry, and overall defense posturing. The cancellation of the fighter jet projects delivered a severe blow to the workforce, which at its peak employed over 120,000 highly skilled employees. When the production lines and factories were abruptly shut down, it forced many of Canada's top aerospace engineers to relocate. A significant number of these skilled workers found new opportunities in the United States, particularly with aerospace giants like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, who prospered on Canadian expertise for decades later. Committed to the principles of democracy and freedom, Canada has participated in numerous US-led foreign interventions since World War II, including the Korean War, the First Gulf War, the Somali Civil War, the Bosnian War, and the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. In a move that aligned with the foreign policies of France and Germany at the time, Canada chose not to fully engage in the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. This decision was based on skepticism towards the evidence presented by the Bush administration regarding weapons of mass destruction. Instead, Canada offered limited support to the invasion. Notably, Canadian Special Forces were involved in several missions to rescue hostages during the conflict. As we started this episode with, in Afghanistan, Canada made a substantial commitment by deploying a significant portion of its armed forces, with estimates suggesting that nearly half, or about 40,000 of its military personnel were stationed there during the peak of the conflict. The war took a heavy toll, resulting in the loss of 158 Canadian soldiers, while thousands more returned home with injuries. Considering the size of their military, both Denmark and Canada, countries recently threatened by Donald Trump, experienced higher casualty rates relative to the size of their forces than the United States. Jumping back to present time, Canada is at a crossroads. Whereas it looked like Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney's Liberal Party was about to lose the upcoming election to self-confessed pro-Trumper Pierre Poilievre, tables have now completely turned. Like we've seen in other countries where Trump and his administration has attacked leaders, their polling numbers and overall approval have gone through the roof, like with the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky, and Mette Frederiksen in Denmark. In fact, it appears like standing up to Trump is the best investment any leader in the world can make in their election campaign or approval rating. So, while US tariffs will hurt Canada in the short term, I think it's fairly clear that few people on Earth are more capable of dealing with short-term pain for long-term gain than Canadians. It's not like Canada lacks the resources to become one of the world's strongest economies without even trading with the US. Take rare earths, as Donald Trump would call it. Canada is among the world's leaders in the production of things like uranium, zinc, nickel, potash, asbestos, sulfur, cadmium, and titanium. Adding to this, Canada also produces 4.5 million barrels of oil per day, which is about a third of the production in the US, with a much smaller population. Much of this was exported to the US before the tariff threat started, and Canada is now leaning heavily into shipping this oil to other markets at a normal market price rather than the discount it gave to the US. In fact, Canada's oil production per capita surpasses that of most countries, except for Norway and some Middle Eastern producers. For every barrel produced per 1,000 inhabitants in the US, Canada produces 3. Even when compared to Russia, Canada's production per capita is still double that of Russia's. Potash stands out as one of Canada's most significant exports to the US, being a crucial ingredient in fertilizer. It is estimated that nearly 80% of the potash used in the United States is imported from Canada, particularly benefiting rural areas. Should tariffs be imposed on this vital resource, as proposed by Trump, fertilizer prices could surge by 25% for many American farmers. Such an increase would significantly erode the profit margins of agricultural operations in regions that form the core of Trump's voter base. It is likely Canada's largest trump card. As Canada reevaluates its military production capabilities in light of a less reliable alliance with the US, it's worth noting that although the heyday of Canadian defense manufacturing has passed, the country still produces some highly capable equipment. This residual capacity could serve as a foundation for rebuilding and enhancing Canada's military self-sufficiency. Let's have a look at what Canada can and does build for itself. Likely Canada's largest strength when it comes to defense manufacturing is its reputation for creating great armored vehicles. The LAV, currently being rolled out in its 7th version, is a staple of the Canadian and Ukrainian Army. I'm going to put this first, based exactly on its great performance in battle conditions in Ukraine and Afghanistan. Going back many years, it was the LAV-3 which formed the basis for the US Striker, and as we know with both of these variants, they've played a crucial role in Ukraine's counterattacks and Kursk operation. I'm not a Canadian politician, but the only thing I'd question with this vehicle is that it is made by General Dynamics, which is an American company. While General Dynamics has a subsidiary in Canada, it is worth questioning whether or not American ownership makes it worthwhile for Canada to keep investing in this series of vehicles, seeing as they may be used as leverage by you-know-who. Perhaps the largest success story to come out of the Canadian defense industry in the last 5 or so years is Roshel. Canada has now delivered 1,000 Roshel Senators to Ukraine, and the factory is 100% Canadian-owned and operated. The Senator is a favorite among Ukrainian special forces, as it appears to be holding up really well against FPVs, mines, and small arms fire. I have read about some controversy surrounding the company and contracts, though maybe some of our Canadian subscribers can enlighten me on what this is about. Canada is renowned for its excellence in manufacturing personal firearms for the military. The Diemaco, now called Colt Canada, C7 and C8 rifles, for instance, are the standard issue for many special operations teams across Europe, with countries like Denmark and the Netherlands adopting these high-tech firearms as their primary weapons. Additionally, Canada continues to uphold its distinguished sniper heritage with the Timberwolf, which is recognized as one of the best medium-range sniper rifles in the world. Unfortunately, the extent of great Canadian military technology to discuss has dwindled significantly over the years. Once a robust producer of a wide array of military hardware in all branches of military, Canada has seen its defense industry dramatically decline. The increasing reliance on American technology over the decades has reduced Canada's national defense industry to a mere shadow of its former self. The good news is that Canada has the potential to regain its prominence in defense manufacturing, but this requires a shift in focus towards self-reliance rather than supporting American defense firms. A significant advantage for Canada lies in its highly skilled automotive industry. Should President Trump follow through on his threats to impose tariffs on Canadian automotive products, this workforce and infrastructure could swiftly pivot to military production. As we've discussed in our very popular series on this topic, which I'll leave in the comments and description, there is a pressing demand in Europe for increased production capacity for Leopard tanks, fighter jets, artillery, and ammunition. Canada possesses the necessary facilities and skilled workforce to not only bolster its own defense capabilities, but also support the rearmament of the free world. And better yet, it has most of the materials needed to do so completely in-house. So what sort of current capability does Canada's armed forces have? Let's start with defense spending. Canada has not been over 2% of GDP in defense spending since the 1980s. While this is a very general indication of how good a nation's armed forces are, it doesn't necessarily tell the whole picture. As we discussed in our previous video on this exact topic, Finland, who has Europe's largest artillery and trained manpower reserve, wasn't really over 2% until 2024 either. It is about what you do with your money, rather than how big of a percentage you spend. The general consensus among the Canadian soldiers I served with in Afghanistan is that Canada's armed forces have long suffered from underinvestment. Though this is a fact, it is about to change rapidly, and the CIF are likely due to get some massive upgrades in the coming years. It appears that the F-35 deal has likely stalled, which is completely natural when Trump is threatening Canada on a near-daily basis, so these funds can be allocated to other aircraft. Canada is also investing heavily in tanks, attack submarines, and more personnel, though many of these things are still in the tender phase. When it comes to manpower, The Canadian Armed Forces currently consists of approximately 68,000 regular members and an additional 27,000 reservists. But it is also worth mentioning that Canada is the country on Earth with the highest amount of trained hunters per capita, and there's likely a possibility of engaging a very large reserve pool if need be. In maritime capabilities, the Royal Canadian Navy operates a fleet that includes 12 Halifax-class frigates, 4 Victoria-class submarines, and 12 Kingston-class coastal defense vessels, among others. While some of these ships are very capable, Canada has one of the largest coastlines to patrol and defend in the world, and will likely need to look into autonomous systems for better cover in the future. The Navy is looking forward to expanding its capabilities with the upcoming Canadian Surface Combatant project, which plans to introduce 15 new advanced warships designed to replace the existing fleet of Halifax-class frigates, as well as 12 new submarines, which Canada is currently looking to Europe for. As mentioned previously, the Royal Canadian Air Force has invested in F-35s to replace their aging F-18 Hornets, but as it stands now with Trump attempting to bully Canada nearly daily, this deal is likely to be either scrapped completely or severely reduced. What Canada will invest their leftover budget in is anyone's guess, but it looks likely that it'll be either a smaller fighter force until European 6th-generation fighter programs are up and running, Rafales or Eurofighters, or alternatively, if Saab can find a way to avoid American parts, it could be the Gripen. Ideally, Canada should lean into one of the European 6th-generation projects, as it has both knowledge and a production base that can aid its European allies in these projects. Whichever way Canada aims to upgrade their armed forces, I suspect that their reliance on American technology is coming to an end. Hopefully, with some strong foresight, Canada can join their traditional allies in Europe, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand, and start thinking about a future where the US is no longer a reliable partner. Canada could become the engine that the rest of the free world needs to rearm. It has everything needed at its disposal, and as it has shown throughout history, it is not afraid to roll up its sleeves, or shall I say put its elbows up, and lean into a fight if it or its allies are threatened. I think I speak for a lot of Europeans when I say that we feel for you. You're currently living in the apartment above a meth lab, and as you've already shown, once you reach out your hand to Europe, we'll gladly cooperate closely with Canada. Your values and way of life is much closer to ours than it ever was your noisy neighbor anyhow. I come from a nation with much the same border exposure to a mad next-door neighbor as you do, and no, I'm not talking about Sweden. Stay strong. A month from today is Canada's election. I hope it goes the way all of you want, without further election interference. May whoever you pick have the guts and stamina to stand up against Trump's administration. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a great weekend, everyone.